Welcome back to another episode of the Samsara Report. If you're wondering why it's just me and we're in a very different setting and I have a painting here, it's because yesterday we had some technical issues doing our podcast and we were going to do a reshoot. Unfortunately, we weren't able to convene together to do that, so you get me, my laptop camera, and my painting. As always, the Samsara Report is a podcast where we discuss spiritual and traditional practices, methods of meditation and understanding, and how we might be able to use and adapt these techniques to challenges that we face today. The topic that we were going to discuss yesterday was the topic of evil, and that's an especially difficult topic, I find, for a number of different reasons. It's challenging to approach it, it's challenging to discuss it, and for all of these reasons, I find it takes a very long time to meditate on the subject, to put together a conception. And one of the places I usually like to start is I like to start with the most basic assumptions that I can think of about a given subject. And by the way, I'm going to be painting while I'm doing this, so my back is going to be turned at certain points. But I do have the audio set up, as you can see, and I'm hoping that that's going to be enough to... I'm hoping you guys can still hear me. But anyway, the point being, one of the most basic assumptions that I find we can start with on a given subject like this is, does it actually exist? Now, everyone's going to have their own answer, and it does depend very heavily, I find, on whether or not you've experienced something especially difficult, particularly malevolent behavior by another person. Now, there's many traditions that take different stances around something like this. I happen to lean towards the Buddhist perspective, but it's because of the pragmatism I find in Buddhism. And the Buddhist perspective is that you don't even necessarily need to tackle the problem of evil if you can tackle the sources of how it manifests in us individually. And according to the Buddha, evil is not so much an external issue that we face. That is the result of three forces acting against us as human beings: greed, hate, and delusion. And the Buddha distinguishes delusion as being the primary force acting against us. It's the one that makes the other two possible in many ways. And this, I find, is a very useful jumping off point in meditation. You can begin by asking yourself the question, where are my blind spots? Where am I not recognizing signals? What signals? And I find here's the question that I use to try and get close to that. I ask myself, what am I least prepared to be wrong about? And even if you don't arrive at an answer, you at least begin to start thinking about areas where you feel especially sensitive to being wrong. And I don't just mean in the sense that you are hoping to be right because somebody else might rub it in your face, or, you'll lose standing, reputation, etc., but because your way of approaching life hinges on this idea. And I find that my mind goes into two different directions when I ask myself this question. In the first instance, I feel that I am not prepared to be wrong about my career decisions. Things that are really parochial, close to me. Things like, have I made the right call by going to university, spending a lot of money and learning within the liberal arts, which increasingly seems like there is much less market demand for, even as I think the thinking skills that you might develop as a result of this are useful. The market still demands and places a premium on things like technical skills. That's what you have to show for it at the end of the day. Are the lights still on, etc.? Now, obviously, there are many examples where critical thinking skills are key and liberal arts education is still really important, i.e. lawyers, doctors, people that are capable of critically thinking out an issue. But increasingly, it's these particular jobs that are becoming replaceable through the use of things like AI. But the other side of the equation for me, when I try to imagine what I feel I am least prepared to be wrong about, is the notion of something like reincarnation. And for me, that's a thought experiment. It's not something that I rest all of my assumptions on, but I do find that it is something that I lean toward and I use to help me make sense of what I see around me. And I do also recognize that I'm not immune to using it in the way that I can never remember the researcher's name. Beck. He was responsible for terror management theory, wherein he posited that much of our lives are the result of how we respond to the ever-present awareness that we will die and the fear that that engenders. So I wonder often about that, even though parts of that theory have been disputed. I wonder how many things I use to try and negate the fear of death, the fear of my life not having meaning, and the idea that my struggle at the end of the day means nothing. I wonder often if I'm using certain ideas like reincarnation around something like that. In any case, I say all of that to turn towards the question of evil. Does it exist? Now, Sapir and I appear to have different takes on this. If you remember from prior podcasts, he does, and I want to give him credit here, he feels that there are very definite examples that we can point to of evil in the world, and that these warrant action, and that it's incumbent upon us to take this action. Now, I don't disagree with him on that, but where I do start to become a little bit wary is around how we are identifying this. As in, I'll share with you now my definition. And I'm not claiming that this is in any way perfected. It still needs to be something that is checked carefully. But for me, I distinguish bad and evil with the presence or lack of ignorance. As in, often good people can do horrible things when they believe that they're doing the right thing. We have many examples of this. There's many examples where in the world, people will go out and they'll try to do right, and they'll protest, and they'll act, or they'll try to right a wrong and unfairness that they see, and as a result, they create more misery. Not because they're bad people, simply because they were missing a piece of information that had they had it, they wouldn't have taken the step that they did. And so this is very, very challenging, but I do find that from that perspective, given that human beings were extremely limited, our neural systems, our cognitive systems are evolved not to give us necessarily a very accurate picture of the world, because that's very energy expensive to create, but it's going to give us an effective perspective, something that we can take and use quickly. So the example that I commonly refer to is the idea of our ancestors hearing a rustling in the bush, and the basic equation being, I'm going to assume that this is a predator, because if I assume it's not, if I'm wrong, I'm dead. If I assume it's not a predator and it is, I'm dead. But if I assume it is a predator and it's not, maybe I've missed a benefit. I still don't miss out on much. So it's safer to me to assume that there are threats where there are none. And that's gotten us this far evolutionarily. I hope I explained that well. It's gotten us this far evolutionarily, but what's not clear to me is what that means for many of our modern issues. But it does seem to shake out in the way that we notice we have a lot of blind spots, and we have a lot of ways in which advertisers and so on can do what's called limbic hijack. They can override our cognitive systems by showing us overwhelming stimuli that appeals to our baser drives. And they do this to the great effect. And obviously this is really, really big in social media. They rely on the ability to hijack our limbic system, our emotions, to get the most engagement in what they call the engagement economy. So a lot of challenges there, but the point being, I feel that most of what I see in the world is the result of generally well-meaning people either being confused or caught up in something rather than being evil. Now, the problem I have to contend with holding that particular view is how do you account for people that do seem to know precisely what effect they're going to have and they do it anyway? And there's a number of really tricky examples, but you think about any regime in the world, for example, that's knowingly cutting off supply lines to civilian populations in a war zone and using starvation as a weapon. Okay? When that is occurring, it's very, very difficult to imagine that the people responsible have no idea that their actions are resulting in a massive toll in terms of collateral damage. Collateral damage, to me, too, is an odd term. The idea of an acceptable civilian death toll and how you might actually calculate that, because it's lawyers that actually, at the end of the day, sign off on certain operations, or at least they're part of the process, and they have to run a calculus. It's a literal trolley problem every time you sit down to work if you're in that position. It's really hard to fathom how you're able to do that day in, day out. I imagine it would take quite a toll, but then, perhaps we're back into the territory that we were discussing, the territory of evil. Maybe you know precisely what effect this is all having, and you do it anyway. And it's harder for me to imagine that evil is more prevalent than bad, because I think most people are well-meaning, and I get the impression, and I could be wrong here, that most people want the same thing. They want security, they want their family to be healthy and safe, they want the means to make a living, they want a means to express themselves, they want to enjoy the food they eat and spend time with the people that they love. And yeah, certainly there are exceptions. There will always be exceptions. But I find most people generally want the same things, the things that I mentioned, and they disagree only about how to get those things. What's the best way to sustain that? What's the best way to integrate that? And so on. Boy, I'm butchering this. The painting, that is. I've been trying really hard to get these trees you see in the foreground to blend nicely. So the challenge is, you'll see a mountain up here, it's golden ears, and because those are the items that I want to focus in the picture, I'm making the items in the foreground, these trees, this forested community area, I'm making it less focused. I'm not using my finest tip brush for this. This might look fine on the camera, but it's quite puffy at the end, and the intention I had in using it was getting kind of an out of focus feeling, because I want this to be the focal point. Anyway, with that said, back to the idea of bad versus evil, I know that my ideas are limited, and I think also for a discussion like this, to better round it out, it's important to consider what other definitions of evil exist, and then more importantly, I think too, what is an example of the good? Now, there's a couple of different angles we can take, and one of the ones that I find myself particularly drawn to is Plato's discussion of eudaimonia. And eudaimonia just means the good. And it's not as well defined, because part of the definition, as I understand it, is that good is something that changes according to the scenario, and it's capable of being flexible, but it ultimately allows and supports growth, the development of the things that people find meaningful, remunerative, restorative, and generally improves the well-being of all involved rather than contributing to destruction. That might also mean, though, that it includes things like pruning the leaves of a rose bush, And that, in some sense, is causing harm. So it's not as though it's free of causing harm, but the overall effect, the effect is one of the positive. So it's kind of vaguely defined. It's a bit like, to me, also Plato's description of the virtues, or perhaps it was Aristotle. To be honest, I get them mixed up a lot. They described vices and virtues as essentially being identical, but that vices are the expression of an emotion, a drive, in a scenario wherein that doesn't lead to the good. Whereas a virtue is any emotion at all that we can feel, but it's calibrated to suit the moment to support the good. That vaguely defined good. And that things like even deep, deep anger have a role in this. They're not wrong per se. They have a role. Any emotion can be part of an expression of virtue, which I really like that. That sounds to me intuitively healthier than imagining that certain emotions are just by default worse, bad, not something you should emulate. It seems much healthier to think of them in terms as being part of a whole system, that there isn't really any favoritism. The body hasn't made a mistake by including these. But the absence of these things, as Plato and actually, as it turns out, St. Augustine, they define evil not as an extant presence necessarily, but merely as the absence of the good. So when you don't have the good, by default, you have evil on some level or another. And that's another component of this, is the spectrum. So then I began to wonder, when I began to think about that, is there a gray area between these, or can these actually be totally distinct? Now, I'm sure you'll agree that life is very, very complicated, and so as a result, there probably are examples that we could point to that look like this sort of gray area, the in-between zone, and that don't really seem to support themselves as either good or evil. You know, the actions might be those that you do your best to try and ensure the safety of others, but in so doing, you know, you have your own trolley problem, and you do have to make a choice that ultimately hurts somebody. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the trolley problem was this famous thought experiment wherein you have 5 people on one track and 1 person on the other track, and there's a number of different ways you can solve the problem. You can pull a lever, and the oncoming train will no longer hit 5 people. Instead, it'll hit the 1 person. But the point is, you have to act. Otherwise, it'll kill the 5 people, and the 1 person will be harmed. And so there's many different approaches. Many of us quibble with the idea that I actually have to exercise some agency, and that my actions are now being included in this, and that somebody dies as a result of my actions, even if I've saved 5 people. That is challenging. And they actually ran this experiment on a show featuring Michael Stevens, the Vsauce guy. Great channel if you haven't seen it. And they put people in this mock scenario. Now, I don't actually know how they did this, because I feel like there's no way to do this with an ethics board today. They put people in a room, they introduced them to a conductor figure of sorts who shows them how to do the track switching as just part of the idle conversation. And then in the scenario, the guy leaves, and these these individuals who are part of this experiment unknowingly then notice a warning signal saying that a train is approaching and that there are people on the tracks and that they have to make a choice. And what they found was most people freeze. They don't want their actions to result in the death of somebody, understandably. And as a result, the 5 people in this mock experiment, no one was harmed. It was all like a pre-recorded video. Nobody acts because they don't want to be culpable. Now, I think you'd need to do a lot of studies to determine how that shakes out. You need a very wide population, because if you're only studying, say, 10 people, you can't generalize to the whole population. Very different parts of the world might have, like, interestingly odd makeups in terms of the kinds of choices that people make and why. Um, so agency does play a big role as part of this discussion, um, which I think is fitting in that the good as well as evil are heavily tied to our notions of agency. What are you using your resources, your time, your ability to do? And what are you doing with the results? So I'm also wondering, when I start to think about this topic, one of the things that occurs to me is I like to listen to a lot of Buddhist podcasts and philosophy podcasts, and I like to try to see just how much utility there is in idea. And particularly, I want people to discuss really hard problems. And if you are, say, living in Lebanon now and you've just seen this major bombing campaign that's gone on, what is actually going to move the needle for you? What's going to help you hold this emotion that you're now feeling, this level of hatred, perhaps, this level of grief? How are you going to manage this? Is there a spiritual technique that will actually move that needle for you? And very often I find, just because the podcasts I listen to have difficulty in maybe talking about everything in a single podcast, they sometimes will keep it to very tepid examples. And I can't fault them for this. I understand you don't want to get too deep in the weeds. So you don't wind up discussing some really, really challenging examples. But I do really want to know about those, because to me it's hard to pretend that there is value in an idea unless it can stand up to really hard real world issues. And I noticed this for me, particularly for the problem of evil. There is a whole lot of time, I find, having read more and more about human history now, trying to solve this problem of evil. And we don't have a terrific set of answers. For example, we have a prison system here where I'm shooting from Canada. And many people have many, many issues with our legal system. But I often find, and I wonder, if it's not because we as a culture, it seems, hasn't quite found a place to stand yet on whether or not the justice system exists as a means of punishing individuals, or if it exists as a way of rehabilitating them. And I'm thinking about an example that I'd heard about from, I believe it was Denmark or Norway. There was a man who was responsible, and forgive me, this is very graphic. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the subject matter is upsetting. So if you're quite sensitive, which I understand, I will give you the warning now to skip ahead, maybe 10, 20 seconds. There was an individual who shot, I believe it was just under 30 children in a schoolyard. And this individual has since stood trial, and many, many, many discussions and many, many arguments, legal and otherwise, were made around what is to be done with this individual, because such an act is so abhorrent. It reaches so deeply into what we consider to be the most valuable and most sacred. It's the life of a child, new potential, the need to be safe, and so deeply does that cut. You really, really have to know, in that instance, what is our justice system for? Is it going to ensure that this individual is never allowed to rejoin society? Is it going to punish them? Or is it going to serve as a source of rehabilitation, if this is possible? And by the way, it's not free of resources. That's an expensive proposition. Taxpayer dollars are required to pay for prisons. It's required to pay for many aspects of the legal system. So not only do you have to decide on whether or not you're going to use public spending to move in one way or the other, but if you decide it is for rehabilitation, you have to then work out how much am I willing to spend on an individual. You do have to put a price tag now on just how far you're willing to go to see that this individual has a chance to be rehabilitated. Now, I will say, as far as I'm aware, it's by no means a perfectly shut public opinion case. I'm sure there are many, many people who still think a wrong decision was ultimately made and that someone who's committed something like this should never, ever be allowed to rejoin society. They should not be given the chance to be rehabilitated. They have lost that privilege as a member of the society. And if not capital punishment, severe corporal punishment should be required. And it's not just about the individual and their capacity to potentially learn from the experience, but it's about what the families want as well. And many people do believe that the family's desire for retribution should take precedent. And now, these are really, really hard problems to solve. I don't envy their judiciary or their legal system. But ultimately, as I understand it, legally, the case was decided that this individual should be given the chance to be rehabilitated. And that's because of the broader societal implication, which is we choose to live in a better world. And a better world, according to this idea, assumes that if you can't rehabilitate somebody, you should at least not cause further harm than what has already been caused. So essentially imprisoning this person for the remainder of their life, or ensuring that if released, they aren't able to enact what they had previous to this, that is a preferable step, because we want to feel like we are part of a society that doesn't act impulsively, doesn't behave barbarically, even if something like this has been committed. Now, that is a doozy. That is such a difficult decision to make, but that's my understanding of what followed in this. And as I said, people were very, very unhappy. This is the problem of evil that we're talking about in some sense. People felt that this individual knew what they were doing, that they were capable, that they did this in spite of knowing the consequences, and therefore they have forfeit all right to any vestiges of a civilized society. I gotta say, I have a hard time arguing against that. If I were a member of the victim's family, I don't know that that would sit easy with me at all. In fact, I know it wouldn't. But that is the other component of the problem of evil, I find, is I keep coming back to an Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote. And he said, "The line between good and evil is drawn down every human heart." And that's a hard one, because many of us, I think, want to believe that we're generally good people, that we're not capable of committing atrocities, and in many ways, probably we aren't. As I mentioned with the trolley problem, a lot of people don't want to ever be in a position where they have to decide the fate of others. Most people will do a great many things to avoid being put in that position, understandably. But this Solzhenitsyn quote basically has us turn our attention to this idea that perhaps we aren't so different. Even the people that we would regard as being absolutely abhorrent and incapable of sharing in civilization, that we are not different from them fundamentally. We have all the same capacities that they do. And that's a really tough one for me. Even if it's just a thought experiment, the idea that we are all one, right? It's a beautiful notion. Namaste, the divinity in me recognizes the divinity in you. But then you start to wonder, what form might this divinity take, right? And this is part of certain reincarnation myths, that if you exist long enough, you will eventually adopt every form. And it's part of learning. It's part of the course of learning that the soul selects according to different facets of yoga, or in, I think, the Bhakti tradition, this idea that even the incarnation of evil, so they do in that belief system take for granted the notion of evil, the expression of evil in a lifetime is actually also partly used as a way of correcting karma. And the story I think you might have heard us talk about in one of the podcasts was the story of Ravana the demon. So in the Hindu tradition, Ravana is a demon who steals Ram's wife. And the story goes that before incarnating as Ravana, that the saints and the gurus meet Ravana in, let's call it the astral plane or the pre-birth plane, and they say, you're very close to enlightenment. You have one more role to play, but it's a doozy. It's a very heavy role. You're going to play a demon who steals God's wife. Bear with me. And once you're able to go through this, you will have corrected your karma and you'll go on, and God will strike you down in this story, and that is the point at which you will reach enlightenment. But just bear with me for now and try to imagine yourself in that position. Let's just take all the elements for granted. You're about to reach enlightenment, and then all these wise figures say to you, you're almost there. You're going to have to basically play the devil in the next life. In all of your supreme ugliness and despicable behavior, you will be the full expression of everything that we regard as horrible. And this is not only okay, but it's necessary. So if you're like me, have a very hard time putting my head into that kind of cosmology, because in that instance, evil is baked into this. It's taken for granted that it's extant, that it exists, and more than that, that it's necessary, that in a funny way, the supreme being deems it to be necessary, which is, funnily enough, in line with the toxic positivity of everything happens for a reason, which everyone I think at this point is probably pretty familiar with that. You would then have to believe that the evil thing that happened in your life, the absolutely most gut-wrenchingly awful part of your life, was absolutely necessary. And I don't know about you, but I don't like that idea. Now, just because I don't like something doesn't mean I can't think about it, because I do think that there is utility. But it's a tough one. It's a really tough one, because many terrible things have happened, and I've led a generally good life. I don't mean I've been good. I mean I've been very, very fortunate. But some very horrible things have happened to people I love, and I'm using the word relatively according to my understanding of life. It's not a contest. I understand that other people have had horrible things happen to them. I'm not trying to take away from that. But anytime anybody that I love is hurt, I consider that to be a terrible experience. And I think all of us probably, I don't need to define it, people know what I'm talking about. That feeling of helplessness when someone you care about is suffering is a really awful feeling. But to think of all of that as having meaning or a necessity on some level, that sucks. I don't care for that. But I do still recognize it's worth playing with the idea. Until I can completely disprove it, I'll work with it. And that's partly karma yoga. But anyway, I do think often about what kind of world we want to live in and what does that look like. And in a lot of ways, it seems like foregoing the impulses that result in us doing things like punishing people. You know, when I think about what is required of us in generating self-control and what that means, the supposition is that holding off, if you think of it like the marshmallow test, holding off on expressing something or doing something you know you don't want to do, that these will ultimately lead to something better. That's why we practice impulse control, because our ancient programming would tell us if the food is available, you eat all of it now because you don't know when you'll get another chance. Same goes for this person that's done wrong. You can't trust them to become better. You can't trust them to break another rule again, because now they understand even better about how to do it, and they've seen that you're not willing to fully carry out a punishment. They might be liable to go even further this time. But the impulse control is largely what we have to thank for the modicum of peace that we enjoy today. Now, granted, we live in a very complicated world still. I'm not saying that it's perfect. Very, very far from that for very many reasons. But if you'll join me in just entertaining the Steven Pinker perspective for a moment, wherein he looks at a very long timeline and he looks at all the metrics that we use to determine whether or not he was a researcher, a psychologist, or maybe just a psychiatrist. See how prepared I am for this? And he looks at all of these metrics for how we determine what a good life is, and rates and reduction of poverty, access and spreading of literacy, the reduction of disease, spreading of vaccines, that all of these things over time are going up, which is a really, really lucky good thing, especially considering that these are expensive propositions. These are not cheap. Take, for example, England foregoing slavery during its development. This was an extremely costly economic decision at the time. It cost them a lot, and a lot of poor people in England got hurt as a result of this. More on that maybe in future, but the point being, like, this was the right thing to do. The arguments held, and yes, many, many people were not arguing this on the basis of it being wrong because it's inhuman to do this. They were arguing for other reasons as well. And the people that thought that this is a necessity economically, slavery that is, they didn't give up without a fight either. So I'm not saying it was this immediate slam dunk perfect solution, by no means. But it was ultimately the difficult thing to do. They still managed to do it. And the result was they took a step that is quite rare in human history. Many, many cultures have risen as a result of adopting slaves, and almost none of them gave them up voluntarily. They almost all gave them up because the civilization collapsed. England was one of the first examples of a country that, albeit very imperfectly, voluntarily gave up a very economically successful model of using slave labor to build their economy. It seems like it's a necessary ingredient on some level. Somebody, Jordan Wheel, made the point that we've reached this stage of development not because we learned how to cooperate better in some sense. I mean, we have in a lot of ways. But rather than using human slaves, his argument was that we have harnessed the power of dead dinosaurs, which learning how to contain an explosion and put that into a functioning engine, i.e. like motor vehicles and all the power that we have to develop machinery as a result. That's, according to him, making slaves out of dead dinosaurs, which are equivalent to many times the amount of human labor that it would take to do something like excavate a given area, to do mining, and building a functioning supply chain. All of these things require enormous amounts of work, and they require some kind of slavery. This one happened to be, as I mentioned, according to Jamie Wheel, I think, the result of harvesting dead dinosaurs, oil. But the idea going back to the legal system and not allowing it to be an extension of our impulses to punish, but serving to rehabilitate where possible, because this is closer to our ideal of what it means to live in a healthy, civilized society, because it's ultimately that we care about. How do we feel within this? Do we have trust in this system? Because trust is an extremely, extremely important commodity. And if you don't have trust in a system like this, if you don't enjoy the system you're living in, that you feel you'd be better off outside of it, well, then the system is effectively moot. It might survive for a long time, but it's not going to sustain itself for long enough. So you need that trust, and part of that trust seems to rest on whether or not you feel your society, your civilization, deserves to keep on living according to the values and the consistency with which it holds those values. So it's really challenging. And then when I think of other examples of evil, and particularly when great harm is done to me, for example, I was bullied. I don't know that I had the kind of ability to manage all the challenges at the time. I felt very vindictive for many years, and I didn't know how to process the emotion. And I didn't notice many practices that I thought would have helped me in that instance. It wasn't until much later that I started to think about not what would be suited for the other person. You know, like a lot of people, I thought that forgiveness meant you're doing this for the other person. Rather, I started to think of it as how much energy am I willing to give to this? And as purely a pragmatic response, I began to explore the idea of forgiveness, but for me, not for the people that I felt were responsible for what was happening. And it's not easy by any stretch, but addressing it in that way has been much more sustainable for me. And it's also changed the way that I think about the world. And it's changed the way I think about the people responsible for what I thought was extraordinarily harmful. It was in many ways, but seeing them as just as flawed and ignorant has been tremendous for me as a way of understanding what had happened, why it happened, how it was able to continue, and ultimately what could be used to stop this cycle. Because I could contribute, I could do harm to them, I could keep all of this going if I wanted to, but to what end? And I think if we all play the tape forward, we'll all see that if we try it that way, which we have ample practice as human beings, we do get the Hatfields and the McCoys, the unending conflict that never really amounts to anything and that only causes pain and suffering. Nobody can grow, nothing can develop. And it's hard because it does require somebody has to be willing to be the first. Now, I'm not necessarily, I did it like I did this as a bravery thing. This is not my example. As I mentioned, I did this as much for pragmatism as I did for anything else. But responding to really hard examples of evil, direct harm, harassment, it becomes really challenging. But one of the few people that I looked at when I was trying to look at ways of addressing evil or the negative in the world was Thich Nhat Hanh. And if you're not familiar with him, he is a Buddhist monk living in Vietnam, and he had survived the Vietnam War, but at great cost. He was exiled, many of his compatriots, family members were killed, and he was exiled to live in France. But rather than continuing to ponder this and to plot revenge, he practiced peace marches. He helped individuals who had been removed from their homes to walk back in the Great Walk Back. He developed meditation practices that were designed to help people heal from their traumatic experiences in the war. He spoke out against the war. He spoke out and criticized those responsible for keeping the cycle going. But he didn't raise his voice in anger. And when you listen to him, this is a man who clearly measures his words very carefully. He is someone who's dedicated himself to the Buddhist practice. But at no point does he regard himself as being more moral. He merely acts in ways that distinguish his behavior from those that he criticizes. He makes it appear as though these are individuals acting out of ignorance, that if they knew, truly knew, they would be incapable of causing the harm that they do. And for this reason, they should be spoken about and spoken to in ways that regard their fundamental humanity, never fully allowing it to let go. And that example that I gave at the beginning, this idea that we should do the thought experiment of imagining that we are the people that we find most abhorrent, he does this too. He spoke out in a poem where he describes himself as every facet of life. He is the grasshopper hopping in the field. He is the spider that eats the grasshopper. He is the little girl who's been captured by pirates in the sea, and he is also the pirate responsible for the suffering of that child. All of this he does in his poetry. He doesn't remove himself from any of this. He doesn't say, I'm better than anyone. And it's very hard for me to imagine that I would be able, that I have that capacity, but I do look to him as one example of someone who really succeeded in turning the other cheek and responding to evil. And I'm thinking about that as in, I don't know how sustainable that is, because if everyone does that and one person still decides to cause death and destruction, well, we're all at the mercy of that one person who's hell-bent on causing harm. And then I don't quite know what the answer is, because that person will outlive everyone else. And evolution seems to bear that out too. Our being here is the result of many, many other hominids competing to survive. And even at the point where we reach Homo sapiens sapien, that which is what we are, we had to compete against other tribes, and those tribes that were peace-based did not survive. We are the composite of those violent tribes, because that method proved to be more effective than turning the other cheek all the time. So then, how do you actually give up what seems like has a lot of utility? It's really hard to argue. And that's why the problem of evil is such a challenging discussion to have. But it is one that I think is worth discussing, because it is, for many of us, a very salient example. What is happening in the world now is very difficult to think about without including the example of evil. The idea that many large companies knowingly invest in infrastructure and AI tools and algorithms that hijack your emotional systems such that they can gain your attention, such that they can sell you whatever it is that they're selling you, knowing that it's causing you harm, that they're willfully getting you addicted, that they are upsetting things like your sleep, your ability to eat, your ability to negotiate and engage and work comfortably with your compatriots, your neighbors, and so on. All of these algorithms we now have really ample evidence of as being responsible for increasing polarization, making people less capable of engaging information, more probable and likely to use coping mechanisms that aren't exactly healthy. There's all sorts of evidence for this. Granted, this technology, I give the devil its due. It's not only responsible for harms, but there are aspects that are knowingly designed in ways that we understand as being unhealthy, and yet they're continuing to design these. It's hard to know what to do with that, because that's a good example to me of evil when I try and think of one. And it's one that you can get to even if you don't have necessarily an overarching villain character. You can get people who are just trying to succeed in their company, and they're told that they have to develop this and so that they can compete with others. This is part of another issue that we've talked about on this podcast. Forgive me if I'm rambling. I mean, this whole thing's been rambling, so forgive me in general. That's the Moloch problem that we've talked about in other podcasts, I think. The idea that it's the bad idea that we all see coming. It's this idea that I must invest in developing the nuke because my enemy may be developing a nuke. Now, we might have a peace treaty. He might say he's not working on it, but how am I to trust that? Better that I develop this in secret on the off chance that he's also developing it in secret, so that if the day actually comes where these things start flying, I'm not ill-prepared. I wasn't caught with my pants down because I wasn't naive. And those are the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with today. But maybe it's a kind of defeatism, but when I look at that, and I start to think about how do I actually want to be in the world, I have to start making very different decisions, because I can't control what everyone else is doing. And I would like to. There is that impulse. I am terrified of what it would be like to accept the amount of responsibility that would come with that, but for at least the sake of defending civilians, people in the world that are just trying to get by, I feel very strongly like I want to wrest control away from the people that I see as misusing it. Politicians who knowingly accept, well, we don't call them bribes in the US and Canada. We call them, campaign donations and lobbying. But it does, in a lot of ways, amount to the same thing. Those people make unscrupulous decisions that result in people being killed and losing their homes and their livelihoods, and you can't do nothing about that. But I start to think about what can I do in my immediate space. And this brings me to my final point from this podcast. One of the things almost every Eastern tradition that I look to says that we can address the problem of evil by starting with the facets of ourselves that we can work with. In other words, look into your own heart and see where you have the impulse to control, to attack, to remain ignorant of the potential harms that you're causing. Look into your own heart and see that you too are capable of this. Not as a masochistic exercise, but as an effort to reduce the separation we have to each other. Because it's only with this separation that this kind of harm is possible. And furthermore, even though these practices that I mentioned make clear that we don't do this with the objective of controlling other people, we are social creatures. And the more we work on ourselves, the more likely we are to have an influence on the people around us. And this isn't by force, it's merely by example. As Ram Dass talks about when he describes karma yoga, one of the practices of recognizing that you're limited, that if you try and solve all the world's problems before you work on yourself, you're just as likely to keep them going as you are to put a stop to them. Karma yoga looks at that and says, you can't do nothing because the world needs help now. You can't act without working on yourself because you aren't perfect and you'll visit all your imperfections out into the world if you don't work on yourself. Karma yoga says, why not do both at the same time? Treat every person you meet as an opportunity to go inward, to see what barriers you have in accepting them, and more importantly, in accepting the aspects of yourself that arise. And as you work on these and you allow them to come up and you see them, and you don't allow them to control your behavior, you just recognize them as, like Naval Ravikant said, the clearing of the inbox. Sorry, that was my downstairs neighbor, if you heard that bang. You think of it like Naval Ravikant said, the emptying of the inbox. You open more and more and more to the person that you're working with. And even if they may be deeply wrapped up in their own trauma, if you are clear enough, you can do for them something phenomenal. One of the only things really that we can do, that when they're ready to come up for air, to realize that as convincing as their experience was of their trauma, of their hurt, of their pain and confusion, that even as it's convincing, it's not necessarily real. And that what they are underneath all of that is still a human being, fundamentally acceptable, fundamentally valuable. That's a very deep place to go and very lofty, and I haven't been able to completely do it, but I do practice this, and I do find it does bear fruit. And that is one of the ways in which I find I can address the problem of evil in the world. I can work on myself. I can see if I can find myself in the people that I regard as causing harm, and I can use my insight to open and deepen such that when that person... Oh, and there's another important component. I do still act. I do sign petitions. I do try and take steps where I can to show that I'm not in support of actions that I regard as being harmful, unnecessary, evil. But I also pick my battles with that because you can't do that 100% of the time. It is exhausting, so you do have to guard your energy. But the inward work, the karma yoga part, that one I can say has borne fruit. And I would love to hear from people if they are able to practice this. It's a challenging practice, but it is worthwhile. I'd be very interested to hear what you guys have to say about that. That's the end of the video. Thank you for being with me while I continue to butcher this painting. It is a laptop camera, so I don't know that you were actually able to see much. In any case, it's been a pleasure. I hope you have a fabulous week wherever you're listening to this. Please send your comments and your ideas. We do love to hear them and we do respond. And we'll talk to all of you next week. Take care.